When I opened that forgotten leather bag on my final route of the night and discovered a handwritten letter signed, "With all my love, Danny Morrison," in the same careful script my son had used since elementary school, I knew that some mysteries can't be solved with logic, and that sometimes the people we've lost find ways to reach across impossible distances to remind us that love doesn't end just because breathing stops. My name is Frank Morrison, and I've been driving city buses for the Dallas area rapid transit system for 26 years, but this isn't just another story about late-night routes and forgotten passengers. This is about how a routine Thursday evening shift became the night I discovered that grief can blind us to miracles, that some messages take years to reach their intended destination, and that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most impossible sources when we finally become ready to receive what we've been too broken to see. It was November 18th, a cold Thursday evening when the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, and I was making my final run on the number 47 route that connects downtown Dallas to the suburban communities along Interstate 35. Route check at 11:47 p.m., passenger count 0, which meant I had the solitary honor of driving an empty bus back to the depot while most of the city settled into sleep, unaware that an ordinary transit worker was about to stumble into an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he understood about death, memory, and the mysterious ways that departed souls continue to watch over the people who can't imagine life without them. The leather bag was sitting in seat 23D, right side of the bus, third row from the back, exactly where countless passengers had sat during my shift, without any of them seeming like the type who would carry such an expensive-looking accessory. It was genuine leather, probably Italian, the kind of briefcase that suggested its owner was either very successful professionally or very sentimental about quality craftsmanship, and it had been placed carefully on the seat, rather than dropped or forgotten in the way that most lost items end up abandoned on public transportation. My first instinct was to follow standard protocol and turn the bag in to the lost and found office at the depot, but something about the way it sat there so deliberately, so prominently positioned, where I couldn't possibly miss it during my routine end-of-shift inspection, made me pause and consider that maybe this wasn't an accidental loss, but an intentional placement, meant for me to discover. As I picked up the bag to examine it for identification tags or contact information, I noticed it was heavier than expected, weighted with something substantial that shifted slightly when I moved it, something that felt like books or documents, rather than the typical contents of a briefcase or purse. The bag wasn't locked, and the clasp opened easily when I pressed the brass mechanisms that looked like they'd been crafted by someone who understood that beautiful things should function as smoothly as they appear elegant. Inside, instead of the business papers, electronics, or personal items I'd expected to find, there was a single manila envelope, thick and substantial, with my name written across the front in block letters that looked familiar but not quite identifiable. The kind of handwriting that triggers recognition without immediate recall of where you've seen it before. Frank Morrison, bus driver, Dart Route 47, was written across the envelope in precise, careful lettering, and beneath that, in smaller script, "To be opened when you're ready to understand that love finds a way." The formality of seeing my name and occupation written out so specifically was unsettling enough, but the personal message beneath it suggested that whoever had left this bag knew not just who I was, but something about my emotional state, my readiness to receive whatever information was contained inside the envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope, partly from the cold November air that had seeped into the bus during my final stops, and partly from the growing realization that this wasn't going to be a routine lost and found situation that could be resolved with a simple phone call to passenger services. The envelope contained a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, expensive paper that felt substantial between my fingers, the kind of stationery that people use for important correspondence rather than casual notes. And when I unfolded it under the bus's interior lighting, I found myself looking at something that should have been impossible. "Dear Dad," the letter began, and immediately I recognized the handwriting as belonging to Danny, my son who had been killed 5 years ago in a motorcycle accident on Highway 183, the same Danny who had been buried in Westland Cemetery with all his letters, journals, and personal papers locked away in my bedroom dresser because I couldn't bear to read them after losing him so suddenly and completely. I know this is going to seem impossible, And I know you're probably wondering if you're losing your mind, or if grief has finally pushed you past the point where you can distinguish between reality and wishful thinking. But I need you to read this letter with the same open heart you had when I was alive, and telling you about all my crazy dreams and ambitious plans for the future. The letter continued in Danny's distinctive handwriting, the same mix of print and cursive letters that he'd developed in high school when he was trying to find a style that looked mature and professional, but still felt comfortable and natural to write. I've been watching you, Dad, and I know you think that dying in that accident was the worst thing that could have happened to our family. But what breaks my heart isn't that I died young, it's that you stopped living when I did. You go to work, you come home, you eat dinner alone, you watch television until you fall asleep in your recliner, and you act like the best parts of your life ended when mine did. But that's not what I wanted for you, and it's not what Mom would have wanted either if she were still alive to help you through this. Reading my son's words, written in his unmistakable handwriting but somehow dated just 3 days ago, according to the timestamp at the top of the page, was like being struck by lightning while standing in a rainstorm, overwhelming and impossible, and completely outside the realm of anything I'd ever experienced or believed could happen. Danny had been 22 years old when he died, full of energy and optimism, and plans for a future that included finishing his engineering degree, traveling to Europe, maybe starting a family of his own someday. And losing him had felt like losing not just my son, but my faith in the possibility that life could be good and meaningful and worth the effort of getting up each morning. The reason I'm writing to you now, Dad, is because you're finally ready to hear what I've been trying to tell you for 5 years, which is that dying doesn't mean disappearing, and losing someone doesn't mean you have to lose yourself too. You've been so focused on what ended when I died that you haven't been able to see what's still possible, what's still beautiful, what's still worth celebrating about being alive and having the capacity to love other people and make their lives better just by being the kind, generous, thoughtful man I always knew you were. The letter was longer than what I could process while sitting in an empty bus in a depot parking lot at nearly midnight. But as I read Danny's words about watching me retreat from life, from friendships, from the possibility of happiness or companionship, or any kind of joy that didn't feel like a betrayal of his memory, I realized that someone who knew me very well had written something designed to address exactly the kind of emotional paralysis that had defined my existence since the night a police officer appeared at my door to tell me that my only child had been killed in an accident that shouldn't have happened and couldn't be undone. There's more I need to tell you, Dad, about why you found this letter tonight and about the person who's going to help you understand that moving forward doesn't mean leaving me behind. But first, I need you to drive home and read the rest of this letter in the house where we were happy together, surrounded by the memories that prove love doesn't die just because people do. Go home, make yourself a cup of coffee the way Mom taught us both to make it, sit in your favorite chair, and read what I wrote about the gift I've arranged for you, the person who's going to help you remember that your story isn't over just because mine ended differently than we expected. The letter was signed, "With all my love, Danny Morrison," in the same careful signature he'd used on birthday cards, graduation announcements, and the lease agreement for his first apartment. The signature I'd seen hundreds of times, but hadn't looked at since sorting through his belongings after the funeral. But beneath his signature, there was additional text in different handwriting, feminine script that looked elegant and unfamiliar, saying, "Frank, your son asked me to make sure you received this letter when you were ready to read it. Please call me tomorrow evening. My number is written on the back of this page. There's so much more he wanted you to know. Elena Rodriguez." The drive from the Dart Depot to my house in Garland normally takes 18 minutes, but that night it felt like both the longest and shortest journey of my life, because I kept alternating between desperate curiosity about the rest of Danny's letter and terrifying doubt about my own mental stability. 5 years of grief had taught me that the mind can play cruel tricks when loss becomes too heavy to carry, that sometimes we see and hear and experience things that feel absolutely real, but exist only in the space between what we desperately want to believe and what we know to be impossible. Danny had been my only child, born when his mother Carol and I were both 31 years old, and finally financially stable enough to provide the kind of childhood we'd both dreamed about during our own less fortunate upbringings. Carol had died of breast cancer when Danny was 16, which meant that for 6 years it had been just the two of us figuring out how to be a family, how to navigate his transition from teenager to young adult, how to support each other through the grief of losing the woman who had been the heart of our household and the source of most of our daily joy and laughter. Those 6 years between Carol's death and Danny's accident had been some of the closest, most meaningful years of my life, because Danny and I had learned to talk to each other with the kind of honesty and affection that many fathers and sons never discover. We talked about everything: his mother's illness and death, his fears about the future, his dreams of becoming a civil engineer who could design bridges and buildings that would last for generations, his girlfriends and heartbreaks, and hopes for eventually finding someone to love the way I had loved Carol, his concerns about leaving me alone when he graduated college and started his own independent adult life. "Dad," Danny had said to me just 3 weeks before the accident, as we sat on the front porch after dinner sharing a beer and watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded us both of Carol's favorite colors, "I want you to promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, I want you to promise that you won't just shut down and stop living." Mom made me promise the same thing before she died, and I kept that promise by staying close to you and making sure we took care of each other. But if I'm not here to take care of you anymore, I need you to promise that you'll find other people to care about, other ways to be happy, other reasons to get up in the morning, besides just going through the motions until it's time to sleep again. At the time, his request had seemed like the kind of hypothetical conversation that young people have when they're trying to make sense of mortality and responsibility, the kind of serious discussion that feels important but also safely theoretical, because death is something that happens to other people, older people, people who've had time to prepare for endings rather than beginnings. I'd promised him what he wanted to hear, because I couldn't imagine a scenario where my 22-year-old son wouldn't outlive me by decades, where I'd be the one left behind to figure out how to honor promises made during conversations that seemed meaningful but not prophetic. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in March, just after 9 p.m., when Danny was riding his Yamaha motorcycle home from his part-time job at an engineering firm where he'd been working while finishing his final semester at UT Dallas. A drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection of Highway 183 and Beltline Road, hitting Danny's motorcycle with enough force to kill him instantly, which the emergency room doctor told me was a mercy because it meant he didn't suffer, didn't have time to be afraid, didn't experience pain or confusion, or the terror of knowing his life was ending before it had really begun. For 5 years after Danny's death, I had kept my promise to him in the most literal, minimal way possible. I got up each morning, I went to work, I came home, I ate dinner, I went to sleep. I repeated the cycle without deviation or enthusiasm or any genuine engagement with the possibility that life could be more than just an endurance test. I avoided his friends because seeing them reminded me that they were continuing to grow and change and build futures, while Danny remained permanently 22 years old. I avoided dating or social activities because enjoying myself felt like betraying his memory, like proving that his death hadn't mattered as much as I'd claimed it did, when people offered condolences and sympathy. Most painfully, I had avoided reading any of Danny's personal writings, the journals and letters and essays he'd written throughout high school and college, because I was afraid that seeing his thoughts and dreams and plans for a future that would never happen would push me past the point where I could function even minimally. His belongings had been sitting untouched in boxes in my bedroom for 5 years, preserved like a shrine to a life that had ended too soon, maintained with the kind of desperate care that people give to objects when the person who used them is no longer available to create new memories or experiences. As I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by furniture that Danny and I had picked out together during his senior year of high school, when we'd decided to redecorate the house as a way of dealing with Carol's absence, I opened the letter again and found myself reading words that addressed my grief with the kind of specific, detailed understanding that could only come from someone who had observed my daily routines and emotional habits with the attention that comes from deep love and genuine concern. "Dad, I know you've been avoiding my journals and letters because you think reading them will make you sadder, but actually, I think you'll discover that I wrote a lot about how grateful I was to have you as my father, how much I learned from watching you take care of Mom during her illness, how proud I was of the way you taught me to be kind and responsible and honest, even when it would have been easier to be selfish or careless. You gave me 22 years of feeling completely loved and supported, And that's a gift that most people never receive, even if they live to be 90 years old. The letter continued with specific memories that Danny had cherished, moments I had forgotten or dismissed as ordinary, but that he had apparently considered significant enough to remember and value. The time I taught him to change a tire in our driveway when he was 14, the conversations we'd had about treating women with respect and kindness, the way I'd supported his decision to study engineering, even though it meant he'd be away from home more than I'd hoped, the pride in my voice when I introduced him to people as my son and explained what he was studying and what kind of career he was planning to build. Before I share what I found when I called Elena Rodriguez the next evening, I want to pause and speak directly to those of you who are listening to this story, those of you who understand what it feels like to lose someone whose death changes everything about how you see the future and your place in it. If you're still with me, if you're recognizing something of your own experience in my struggle to figure out how to keep living when the person who gave your life meaning is gone, then you know this isn't just entertainment or a way to pass time while you're doing something else. This is about the questions that keep you awake at night, wondering if you're honoring someone's memory correctly, if you're allowed to be happy again without dishonoring their life, if love continues after death in ways that we can sense and respond to, or if grief just makes us imagine connections that comfort us but aren't real. These are the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers, that can't be resolved with simple advice or quick fixes, that require us to be honest about how complicated loss really is, and how difficult it can be to figure out what it means to live well after losing someone who made life feel worth living. If Danny's letter is reminding you of conversations you wish you could have with someone you've lost, if my 5 years of emotional hibernation sounds familiar because you've done something similar after your own devastating loss, if you've ever wondered whether the people we love can somehow reach across the divide between life and death to guide us toward healing and hope, then I want you to know that sharing these experiences with each other is one of the most important things we can do. We tell these stories not because they're entertaining, but because they remind us that we're not alone in wondering how to love completely while also accepting loss, how to honor the dead while still choosing to be fully alive, how to distinguish between healthy grief and destructive isolation. If this story is speaking to something in your own heart, would you consider being part of our community here? Not because I'm trying to convince you to subscribe to just another channel, but because I believe that when we're brave enough to share our deepest struggles and most profound healing with each other, we create something sacred, something that helps all of us feel less alone in figuring out how to live with both gratitude for what we've had and hope for what might still be possible. Leave a comment and tell us about the people you've lost who continue to influence your life, about the ways you've tried to honor their memory, about moments when you felt their presence or guidance in ways that seemed impossible but also completely real. Share your thoughts about Danny's letter, about whether you think it's possible for love to transcend death, about times when you've received exactly the message you needed, exactly when you were ready to hear it. This is more than just a channel. It's a place where people who understand that love doesn't end with death can find each other and share the wisdom that comes from learning to live fully, even after losing what we thought we couldn't live without. The next evening, I sat in the same chair where I'd read Danny's letter the night before, holding my phone and staring at Elena Rodriguez's number for nearly 20 minutes before I found the courage to dial it. The woman who answered on the second ring had a warm, gentle voice with a slight accent that suggested Spanish might have been her first language, and when I introduced myself as Frank Morrison, the bus driver who had found the letter, she responded with the kind of immediate recognition that told me she'd been expecting my call and had probably been thinking about our conversation for some time. "Mr. Morrison, thank you so much for calling," Eleanor said, and I could hear both relief and nervousness in her voice, as if she'd been hoping I would reach out, but hadn't been certain that I'd be ready to take that step. "I know this whole situation must seem impossible to understand, and I want you to know that I wouldn't have been part of anything like this if I hadn't experienced something similar myself, something that convinced me that the people we love don't just disappear when they die. They find new ways to take care of us when we need them most." Elena explained that she was a grief counselor who worked with families who had lost children to accidents, violence, and sudden illness, and that she had first encountered Danny not as a ghost or apparition, but as a recurring presence in her dreams and meditations that had begun about 6 months ago and gradually became more frequent and detailed until she felt compelled to try to understand what he was trying to communicate. I know how this sounds, Mr. Morrison, and I wouldn't blame you if you thought I was delusional or trying to take advantage of your grief, but I've learned to pay attention when someone who has passed away becomes this persistent in trying to get my attention, especially when they're as specific as Danny has been about wanting to help their surviving family members. The conversation that followed challenged everything I thought I understood about death, memory, and the possibility that consciousness might continue in forms that we don't yet have adequate language or scientific frameworks to explain. Elena described months of increasingly vivid encounters with Danny during her meditation sessions, encounters where he provided specific information about our life together that she couldn't have obtained through research or guesswork, the way Carol had taught. Both of us to make coffee with cinnamon and vanilla, Danny's habit of leaving engineering textbooks on the kitchen table while he studied late into the night, my tendency to fall asleep in my recliner while watching old westerns on television, the promise Danny had asked me to make about not shutting down if anything happened to him. The first few times Danny appeared in my meditations, I tried to dismiss it as my imagination or as some kind of psychological projection based on my work with grieving families, Elena continued, her voice growing more confident as she shared details that she'd clearly thought about extensively before deciding to act on the information Danny had apparently been providing. But then he started giving me specific instructions about how to find you, what route you drove, what time you finished work, even which seat he wanted me to leave the bag in so that you'd be sure to discover it during your end-of-shift inspection. Elena had been following Danny's instructions for 3 weeks before she finally worked up the courage to board my bus on that Thursday evening, carrying the leather bag that had belonged to her late husband and the letter that Danny had apparently dictated to her during sessions where she felt his presence so strongly that she'd been able to transcribe his words almost as if he were sitting beside her speaking aloud. He was very specific about the timing, Mr. Morrison. He said you weren't ready to receive his message until now, until you'd been grieving long enough to understand that shutting down wasn't the same thing as honoring his memory, and that you'd reached the point where you might be willing to consider that love continues after death, and that the people we lose want us to find new ways to be happy rather than new ways to punish ourselves for surviving when they didn't. The complexity of what Elena was describing should have made me skeptical or dismissive, but instead I found myself recognizing details and insights that felt too accurate and too specific to be coincidental. She knew that Danny had been worried about leaving me alone, that he'd made me promise not to shut down if something happened to him, that I'd been avoiding his personal belongings because I was afraid of being overwhelmed by reminders of everything he'd planned but would never accomplish. She even knew that Carol had made Danny promise something similar before she died, creating a chain of promises about taking care of each other that connected all three of us, even though only I was still alive to remember and honor them. Danny wants to meet with you in person, Elena said, and for a moment I thought she meant that somehow my son had found a way to return from the dead in physical form, but she quickly clarified that she was talking about a session where I could communicate with him through her, where he could share the rest of what he'd been trying to tell me, and I could ask questions or express concerns about moving forward with my life without feeling like I was abandoning his memory. He's been very clear that he has more to tell you about Carol, about promises she made to him before she died, that he wasn't able to share with you while he was alive, and about specific ways he wants to help you find companionship and purpose and reasons to be excited about your future, rather than just resigned to going through the motions until it's your time to join them. The session Elena suggested felt like stepping off a cliff into territory that I'd never imagined exploring, but after 5 years of existing rather than living, after reading a letter that addressed my emotional paralysis with uncomfortable accuracy, after years of feeling like I was disappointing both Carol and Danny by choosing isolation over engagement with life, I found myself agreeing to meet with her the following Saturday afternoon at her office in Richardson, just 20 minutes from my house and convenient to reach, without requiring me to take time off work or explain my plans to anyone who might question my decision to consult with someone who claimed to communicate with the dead. Mr. Morrison, before we meet, I want you to do something that might be difficult but that Danny says is necessary for you to be ready to hear everything he wants to share with you, Eleanor said as our phone conversation was winding down. He wants you to go into your bedroom and read his journals. Not all of them, but specifically the entries he wrote during the last 6 months of his life, after his 22nd birthday in September. He says there are things in those entries that will help you understand that he was already thinking about your future happiness, already concerned about what would happen to you if something happened to him, already making plans to ensure that you'd have support and guidance, even if he wasn't there to provide it in person. The prospect of reading Danny's private thoughts during his final months felt both terrifying and necessary, like surgery that would be painful, but ultimately healing if I could endure the immediate discomfort for the sake of long-term recovery. That night, for the first time since his funeral, I opened the boxes of Danny's belongings that I'd stored in my bedroom closet and found his journals, 5 leather-bound notebooks, where he'd recorded his thoughts, experiences, plans and concerns throughout his college years with the kind of thoughtful reflection that suggested he understood that writing things down was a way of making sense of experiences that might otherwise remain confusing or overwhelming. The entries from his final months revealed a young man who had been thinking seriously about mortality, responsibility, and the nature of love in ways that were both mature and heartbreaking to read 5 years after his death. Danny had written extensively about his concerns for my well-being, his awareness that losing Carol had changed me in ways that made him worry about what would happen to me if I experienced another major loss. His desire to find ways to ensure that I would have reasons to keep engaging with life even if he wasn't there, to provide daily companionship and emotional support. Dad doesn't realize that he's already lost so much of himself since Mom died, Danny had written in an entry dated February 14th, just 3 weeks before the accident. He goes through all the right motions, but he's not really present in his own life anymore, and I'm scared that if anything happens to me, he'll just completely withdraw from everything that used to bring him joy. I need to figure out how to help him understand that loving someone completely doesn't mean you can never love anyone else, that missing someone doesn't require you to reject all possibilities for new connection and happiness. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crystalline November sunlight that makes everything look sharp and hopeful, and as I drove to Elena Rodriguez's office in Richardson, I found myself alternating between nervous anticipation and the strange calm that comes from finally taking action after years of emotional paralysis. Elena's office was in a converted house near the UT Dallas campus, surrounded by oak trees that had shed their leaves into golden piles that crunched under my feet as I walked toward a front door marked with a simple brass plaque reading, Elena Rodriguez, licensed grief counselor and spiritual medium. And Elena herself was nothing like what I'd expected from our phone conversation, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of warm, intelligent eyes that suggested she'd spent years listening to people share their deepest pain and most desperate hopes. She welcomed me into an office that felt more like a comfortable living room than a clinical space, with soft lighting, bookshelves filled with volumes on psychology and spirituality, and furniture arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal consultation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm so glad you decided to come," Eleanor said, as she offered me tea and guided me toward a comfortable armchair positioned across from where she would sit during our session. "Before we begin, I want you to know that everything that happens here today is going to be guided by what you're comfortable with and ready to hear. Danny has been very clear that this session is about healing and hope, not about proving anything supernatural or convincing you to believe in things that don't make sense to you. This is about love continuing after death, about family connections that transcend physical separation." As Elena settled into her chair and began the meditation process that she explained would allow her to connect with Danny's presence, I found myself thinking about the journal entries I'd read during the past 2 days, entries that had revealed my son's sophisticated understanding of love, loss, and the responsibility that the living have to honor the dead by choosing life, engagement, and openness to new experiences rather than withdrawal, isolation, and emotional hibernation. "Danny is here with us now," Eleanor said after several minutes of quiet breathing and concentration, and her voice had taken on a different quality, softer and somehow younger, as if she were channeling not just Danny's words, but something of his personality and speech patterns. "He wants you to know first that he's not in pain. He's not lost, he's not stuck between worlds or suffering in any way. Death was like waking up from a dream into a broader reality where love is more real and present than it ever was during physical life, and where the connections we make with people don't end just because one person's body stops functioning. The next hour was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a conversation where Elena seemed to disappear, and Danny's personality emerged through her voice, mannerisms, and knowledge of details about our life together that she couldn't have known through any conventional means. Danny talked about watching me retreat from life after his death, about understanding that I'd been trying to honor his memory by preserving everything exactly as it had been when he was alive, about wanting me to realize that the best tribute I could pay to our relationship would be to use the love he'd taught me to give and receive as the foundation for new relationships, new experiences, new reasons to be grateful for being alive. Dad, Carol and I have been together here, and we've been planning something for you, something that Mom started before she died, and that I've been trying to complete since I joined her, Danny said through Elena's voice, using inflections and expressions that were absolutely characteristic of the way my son had spoken when he was trying to explain something important to me. Mom was worried about leaving you alone with just me to take care of you, and she made me promise that if anything happened to both of us, I would find a way to ensure that you had family, people who would love you and look after you, and remind you that your story wasn't over just because ours had ended differently than we'd all hoped. Danny went on to explain that he and Carol had been guiding events in my life for months, in ways that I hadn't recognized, creating opportunities for me to meet people who could become sources of companionship, support, and eventual healing if I became willing to notice their presence and respond to their overtures of friendship. There's a woman named Margaret who rides your bus route twice a week, always sits in seat 12A, always nods and smiles at you when she gets on and off the bus. She's been riding your route for 8 months, Dad. Not because she needs public transportation to get around, but because she's been hoping you'd eventually notice that she's there and maybe start a conversation with her. The description Eleanor provided of Margaret matched someone I'd been vaguely aware of but had never really paid attention to, a woman probably in her late 50s who indeed sat in the same seat and always acknowledged my presence with the kind of gentle friendliness that I'd assumed was just routine politeness between strangers who happen to share the same commute schedule twice a week. Margaret is a retired teacher, Dad, widowed for 4 years, and she has 2 grown children who live in other states, which means she understands exactly what it feels like to have plenty of love to give, but no one close enough to receive it on a daily basis. She started riding your bus after she noticed that you looked as lonely as she felt, and she's been hoping that eventually you'd recognize that she was interested in more than just transportation. Danny also told me about a neighbor 3 houses down from mine, an elderly man named Walter, who'd been trying for months to engage me in conversations about our shared interest in vintage cars, specifically the 1967 Camaro that I'd been restoring in my garage as a project that Danny and I had planned to work on together. Walter has a 1965 Mustang that he's been restoring by himself, and he's been hoping you'd notice him working in his driveway and maybe come over to talk about engines and paint jobs and what it's like to bring something beautiful back to life after it's been neglected for too long. He's also widowed, Dad, lost his wife 2 years ago, and he understands that sometimes working on cars with someone else is easier than talking about feelings, but just as effective for building the kind of friendship that makes life feel less empty. The session continued with Danny providing specific information about opportunities for connection, service, and purpose that existed in my daily life, but that I'd been too emotionally shut down to recognize or pursue. He mentioned volunteer opportunities at the engineering department at UT Dallas, where I could mentor students who were studying the same field he'd been passionate about, church activities that would connect me with other people who understood loss and faith in complex, mature ways, even social groups for people our age who were interested in hiking, reading, or community service projects that would give me reasons to get out of the house and remember what it felt like to care about something beyond just surviving from one day to the next. The most important thing I want you to understand, Dad, is that loving me completely and missing me forever doesn't require you to stop loving other people or to reject all possibilities for new happiness, Danny concluded through Elena's voice, and I could hear both his characteristic gentleness and his determination to make sure I understood what he was trying to communicate. Carol and I want you to use the love we shared as the foundation for more love, not as a reason to build walls against new relationships and experiences. We want you to be the same kind, generous, thoughtful man with other people that you were with us, because that's how you honor our memory, and that's how you continue the family values we all believed in. As Elena gradually returned to her normal voice and personality, I found myself feeling simultaneously drained and energized, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the experience, but also filled with a sense of clarity and purpose that I hadn't felt since the night Danny died. The session had addressed questions I'd been afraid to ask and provided guidance I'd been too proud or too frightened to seek through conventional counseling or therapy, and it had done so in a way that felt completely consistent with the loving, thoughtful young man I'd raised and the wise, caring woman I'd been married to. "Mr. Morrison, how are you feeling?" Eleanor asked gently as she offered me tissues and water, clearly recognizing that I needed time to process what had just occurred. "Danny wanted me to tell you that this doesn't have to be the end of your communication with him and your wife, but he also wanted you to understand that the purpose of today was to give you permission and encouragement to start living again, not to become dependent on spiritual sessions as a substitute for engaging with the physical world and the people who are available to love and be loved by right here, right now." The weeks that followed my session with Elena Rodriguez transformed my understanding of what it means to honor the dead by choosing to live fully, and as I began to notice and respond to the opportunities for connection that Danny and Carol had apparently been placing in my path for months, I discovered that grief and healing aren't opposites but rather different aspects of the same ongoing relationship with love that continues to grow and change even after the physical presence of our beloved has ended. Margaret Torres had indeed been riding my bus route twice a week for 8 months, and once I started paying attention to her presence rather than simply acknowledging it with professional politeness, I realized that her warm smiles and gentle attempts at conversation had been invitations to friendship that I'd been too emotionally numb to recognize or accept. When I finally took Danny's advice and initiated a real conversation with her by asking about the library books she always carried, I learned that she was a recently retired high school English teacher who had been widowed 4 years earlier and was struggling with many of the same questions about loneliness, purpose, and the possibility of building new relationships without betraying the memory of her late husband. "I've been riding this bus route for months, hoping you'd eventually notice that I was trying to get your attention," Margaret admitted during our first real conversation, which took place during her usual Thursday evening commute and extended well past her normal stop, because neither of us wanted to end the discussion once we'd finally started talking honestly about loss, loneliness, and the challenge of remaining open to new connections after experiencing devastating grief. "My daughter Sarah lives in Seattle, and she's been encouraging me to meet people, make friends, maybe even consider dating eventually, but it's hard to know how to start when you've been married for 34 years and suddenly have to figure out how to be social again." Margaret and I began meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings at a diner near my house, conversations that started as mutual support between two people who understood grief, but gradually evolved into the kind of friendship that made both of us remember what it felt like to have someone to share daily experiences with, someone who was genuinely interested in our thoughts and feelings and concerns about the future. Margaret had a sharp sense of humor, a love of books and movies that complemented my own interests, and the kind of emotional maturity that comes from surviving major loss without becoming bitter or permanently closed off to new possibilities. Walter Jenkins, my neighbor with the 1965 Mustang, turned out to be exactly the kind of friendship Danny had described, a man who understood that sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen while working with your hands on mechanical problems that have clear solutions, unlike the emotional problems that require time, patience, and gradual healing rather than immediate fixes. Walter and I began spending Saturday afternoons working on our respective car restoration projects, sharing tools, advice, and the comfortable companionship that develops between men who have both experienced significant loss but are still committed to creating something beautiful and functional from things that had been broken or neglected. "My wife Ruth would have loved watching us work together like this," Walter told me one afternoon, as we were rebuilding the carburetor on his Mustang, his voice carrying the kind of wistful affection that I recognized from my own memories of Carol and Danny. "She always said that the best therapy for grief was having something to fix with your hands, while you let your heart work on healing whatever needed to be repaired inside. I think she would have liked your son too, from everything you've told me about him. Sounds like he was the kind of young man who understood that taking care of people is what makes life meaningful. The volunteer work at UT Dallas that Danny had mentioned turned out to be even more rewarding than I'd expected. An opportunity to mentor engineering students who were struggling with the same challenges and ambitions that had driven Danny throughout his college years. Working with these young people allowed me to share stories about Danny's academic journey, his problem-solving approach, his enthusiasm for designing things that would last long enough to benefit future generations. And in sharing those memories, I discovered that talking about Danny's life and dreams actually brought me more comfort than avoiding all reminders of his absence had ever provided. 6 months after my session with Eleanor, Margaret and I had progressed from coffee meetings to dinner dates, from friendship to something that felt like the beginning of romantic love, but love that was different from what I'd experienced with Carol, deeper and more conscious because it was built on shared understanding of loss, rather than shared dreams of a future that seemed guaranteed and permanent. Margaret understood that I would never stop loving Carol or missing Danny, and I understood the same about her relationship with her late husband Robert, but we also discovered that loving people who had died didn't prevent us from loving someone who was very much alive and available to build new memories, new traditions, new reasons to be grateful for whatever years we had remaining. "Frank," Margaret said to me one evening as we sat on my front porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in the same colors that had reminded Danny and me of Carol's favorite autumn decorations, "I want you to know that I don't see myself as replacing anyone in your heart or your life. I see myself as being part of a love story that includes Carol and Danny and Robert, all of us connected by the understanding that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself and new people to include in the circle of caring that makes life beautiful and meaningful." A year after finding Danny's letter in that forgotten leather bag, Margaret and I were married in a small ceremony at the church, where Carol and I had been married 32 years earlier, surrounded by friends we'd made through our volunteer work, neighbors who had become family, and Walter, who walked Margaret down the aisle because her own father had passed away several years earlier, and she wanted someone who understood the significance of building new family connections without forgetting the ones that had come before. Elena Rodriguez attended our wedding, and afterward she told me that Danny and Carol had both been present during the ceremony, not as visible apparitions, but as a feeling of blessing and approval that had filled the church during the exchange of vows. "They're both so happy, Frank," Elena said as she hugged me during the reception. "They wanted you to know that this is exactly what they hoped for when they started trying to bring you and Margaret together, not a replacement for what you lost, but an expansion of what love can become when we're brave enough to remain open to new possibilities, even after experiencing devastating loss." Today, Margaret and I have been married for 2 years, and we've created a home that honors our past loves while celebrating our present happiness, a place where photographs of Carol, Danny, and Robert share space with pictures of our current adventures, where traditions from our previous marriages blend with new customs we've developed together, where grief and joy coexist in the natural rhythm that characterizes mature love, built on mutual understanding rather than desperate need or fear of being alone. We volunteer together at the engineering department, travel together to places that both our late spouses had wanted to visit, maintain friendships with Walter and other people who understand that second chances at love in later life aren't consolation prizes, but rather evidence that the human heart's capacity for connection and growth doesn't diminish with age or experience of loss. It actually expands when we choose courage over fear and openness over protective isolation. And here's what I want you to understand as we reach the end of this story. Every choice that led to Margaret and me finding each other was made possible by people who understood that love doesn't end with death. It transforms and continues to guide the living toward healing, hope, and new possibilities for happiness that honor rather than diminish what came before. Danny's letter, Elena's willingness to serve as a messenger, Margaret's patient persistence in trying to get my attention, Walter's gentle friendship, all of these connections were part of a network of caring that proved love is stronger than loss when we have the courage to remain open to receiving it. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it's reminded you that it's never too late for second chances or new love, if it's helped you think differently about honoring the dead while choosing to live fully, I would be deeply grateful if you'd become part of our community here. We share these stories because they represent possibilities that exist for all of us, regardless of how much we've lost, or how long we've been grieving, or how impossible it seems that our hearts could ever feel whole again. Subscribe if you believe that love stories don't end with death, that the people we've lost want us to find new reasons for happiness, that healing and hope can coexist with grief and remembrance in ways that make both more meaningful. Leave a comment and tell us about your own experiences with signs from loved ones who have passed away, with unexpected opportunities for connection that appeared exactly when you needed them, with moments when you realized that honoring someone's memory might mean choosing life and love rather than isolation and sorrow. Share your thoughts about Elena's gift for spiritual communication, about whether you believe our departed loved ones can guide us toward healing and new relationships, about times when you felt presence or guidance from someone who was no longer physically with you, but whose love continued to influence your choices and direction. Tell us about the Margarets in your life, the people who patiently offered friendship or love while you were too hurt or scared to notice their presence, the second chances you've been given or the ones you're still hoping for. Tell us about your own Danny or Carol, the people whose loss felt like the end of your story, but who might actually have been preparing you for a new chapter you couldn't yet imagine. Share your experiences with grief that transformed into gratitude, with love that expanded rather than diminished when you chose to honor the past while embracing new possibilities, with the courage it takes to remain open to joy even after experiencing profound sorrow. This is more than just a channel. It's a sanctuary for people who understand that the most important journeys are the ones that lead us back to connection, compassion, and the courage to love again, even when love has brought us the deepest pain we've ever experienced. We're here because we know that hope isn't naive, that second chances are gifts to be treasured, that it's never too late to write new chapters in the story of our lives, as long as we remain willing to believe that love truly is stronger than death, and that our best days might still be ahead of us, waiting to be discovered and embraced with all the wisdom and appreciation that comes from understanding how precious and fragile and absolutely worth fighting for human connection really is.